The first time Aaron Holloway heard a kind word spoken in his direction, he stood in the middle of a dusty street in Redemption Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1882, and he could not for the life of him remember what a person was supposed to do with such a thing. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that had named itself after something it never quite achieved. It sat at the base of the Ruby Mountains like an afterthought, 40-some structures leaning into one another for support, the way drunks lean against saloon walls. There was a general store, a livery, a church nobody had finished building in 11 years, a post office that smelled of mildew, 2 saloons, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway who charged too much and asked too many questions. The railroad had promised to come through 3 years ago and had instead gone 20 miles north, which had broken the spirit of the place in the particular way that broken promises do, quietly, completely, without ceremony. Aaron Holloway had ridden into Redemption Creek 14 months ago on a gray horse named Ghost, with nothing but a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, and a grief so enormous it took up all the space inside him that a person might otherwise use for conversation, for courtesy, for any of the small social gestures that mark a man as human rather than simply animal. He had taken a room at the boarding house, paid Mrs. Calloway 3 months in advance with money he had left from the sale of the ranch he used to own in Colorado, and had set about the business of disappearing while still technically being present. He worked at the livery when he needed coin. He ate at the boarding house when he needed to eat. He drank at Malone's saloon on Friday nights because the whiskey was better than the loneliness, and then he rode back to his room and lay on a bed that felt too wide and stared at a ceiling that had no answers. He had not said a kind word to a living soul in 14 months, not because he was a cruel man, he was not. He had once been the sort of man who remembered birthdays, who helped a neighbor pull a wagon from the mud, who said thank you like he meant it and good morning like the morning mattered. He had once been the sort of man his wife, Clara, had fallen in love with. Clara had died 16 months ago on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Not a dramatic day, not a day worth the weight it had been given. She had taken fever in early winter and the fever had not let go. The doctor in their Colorado town had done what he could, which was not enough. Aaron had sat beside her for 9 days. He had held her hand through all 9 of those days, and on the 10th day she was simply gone, and he had not known what to do with his hands after that. He had not known what to do with any part of himself. So he had sold everything, gotten on Ghost, and ridden west until the terrain matched the inside of him, vast and dry and without clear direction. He ended up in Redemption Creek. He stayed because he had stopped caring where he was, and for 14 months he had existed in the town the way a stone exists in a riverbed present, unmoved, speaking only when necessary, and then in the flattest possible way, transactional and brief, as though every word cost him something he could not afford. The men at the livery had learned not to bother him with pleasantries. Mrs. Calloway had given up on her questions after the 2nd month. The men at Malone's knew to leave the bottle and not the conversation. Even the barber, a chatty man named Prout who could sustain a monologue through any haircut regardless of audience engagement, had eventually fallen into a kind of respectful silence when Aaron sat in his chair. Redemption Creek had, collectively, accommodated his grief the way a river accommodates a rock. It simply went around him. And then Birdie Donnelly arrived on the afternoon stage on a Thursday in April. She came with 2 carpet bags, a hat box, a small wooden trunk that required 2 men to carry, and the kind of energy that made people stop what they were doing and look. Not because she was flashy, she was not. She wore a brown traveling dress that had seen considerable use, her dark hair pinned back under a practical hat, her face wind-burned from the journey. She was 26 years old, and she had the kind of face that rewarded a second look, which was the better kind, the kind built of something more lasting than immediate prettiness. Her eyes were the color of creek water in shadow, that particular gray-green that shifts depending on the light, and they were the eyes of a woman who paid attention to things, who noticed what other people missed. She had come from St. Louis, which she would tell people readily enough. She had come, more specifically, because her aunt had died and left her a small piece of land and a half-finished house 3 miles outside of Redemption Creek, which she would tell people when they asked. Why she had come alone, with no husband and no brother and no father, this she would tell only in pieces, and only to the right people, and only when the moment felt earned. She had exactly $42 and some cents. She had a recipe book her mother had kept before she passed. She had a letter from the lawyer in Redemption Creek, confirming the land was hers. She had, if you wanted to get philosophical about it, nothing to go back to and something ahead of her, which was a better situation than many and worse than some. Aaron Holloway was crossing the main street on his way to the livery when the stage pulled in, and he was not paying attention because he never paid attention to the stage anymore. He had stopped looking up for arrivals around month 3. So he was caught entirely off guard when a carpet bag caught him squarely in the shoulder, not thrown, just swinging down off the stage in a way that lacked coordination. And he turned, already composing the flat-voiced response he used for all unexpected situations. And Birdie Donnelly looked at him from the top of the stage steps, her hat slightly askew, holding a hatbox that she had apparently misjudged the swing room on, and she said, clear and warm and without a trace of social performance, "Oh, I am so sorry. That was entirely my fault. Are you all right?" 3 things happened in Aaron Holloway in that moment in rapid succession. The first was that he registered she was genuinely asking, not performing an apology, not doing the social dance. Actually asking, the way you ask about someone you are actually concerned about. The second was that something moved in him, in the place where feeling used to live, the way ice cracks in early spring, not broken through, just acknowledging the season had changed. The third was that he had no idea what to say. He had said yes, no, thank you, how much, fine, and not interested 14,000 times in 14 months. He had not said anything that required him to receive genuine human warmth and respond in kind. He stood there in the April dust with a carpet bag that had bounced off him and a woman looking at him with real eyes, and he tried to find the language. He said. He stopped. He cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "Fine, it is yes, I am fine." It was the most words he had strung together in a social context in 14 months. It was deeply inadequate, but it was also, given what he was working with, a kind of effort. Birdie looked at him a half-second longer than was strictly necessary, and something passed through her expression, not pity, which he would have recognized and resented, but something more like recognition, the way a person recognizes a landscape they have not been to but somehow know. Then she smiled, not the big performed kind, just the small real kind, and said, "Good. I am glad," and turned to supervise the man who was attempting to carry her trunk and making a poor job of it. Aaron stood in the street another moment. Then he walked to the livery. He did not think about her. He made a very deliberate and conscious effort not to think about her. He thought about her all afternoon. He could not have explained what it was, and he would not have tried. He was not a man who examined his own interiors with any enthusiasm. But that evening, sitting on the edge of his bed in the boarding house with the last light coming through the dirty window, he found himself replaying those 3 sentences of hers, turning them over the way you turn over a coin you found on the road, not knowing if it's valuable but unwilling to put it down. He told himself it was because he had simply not heard someone speak to him that way in a very long time. He told himself it meant nothing. He slept badly and woke before dawn and went to the livery and worked hard and was slightly less grim with the horses than usual. Birdie Donnelly, meanwhile, had installed herself at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, having discovered that the half-finished house on her aunt's land was more than half-finished in some rooms and barely started in others. and had begun the process of taking stock of her situation with the practical, forward-moving energy that was her primary character trait. By her second morning she had met the lawyer, a thin, worried man named Perkins, confirmed that the land was indeed hers and free of encumbrance, established that the house would need a roof repaired, 2 windows replaced, a porch rebuilt, and a well cleaned before it was livable, and had begun making inquiries about how to accomplish these things on $42. The answer, it turned out, was not all of them. She sat in Perkins' office on a Friday morning, a small notebook open on her knee. She kept a notebook always, which was a habit that had served her well, and that the people around her often found mildly alarming. And she did the arithmetic with the focused grimness of someone who has done arithmetic in difficult circumstances before. She could fix the roof and the well, or she could replace the windows and fix the porch, but she could not do all of it immediately. She would need to find work. She had skills, she could cook, she could keep accounts, she had instinct. Louis kept books for a dry goods store for 3 years, which was where the $42 had come from, saved coin by coin over that time. She asked Perkins if anyone in town needed a bookkeeper. Perkins thought about it and said slowly that Malone at the saloon kept terrible books and frequently looked harassed about it. He said it in the tone of a man who is not entirely sure this is appropriate to suggest to a respectable young woman, and Birdie noted his expression and said, steadily, that she had not come this far to be particular about where the work came from. She walked into Malone's saloon at 10 in the morning when it was quiet enough to conduct business, sat down across from a large, red-faced man who turned out to be Frank Malone, and offered to sort out his accounts for a fair rate per week. She placed her references on the table, which were letters from the dry goods store in St. Louis, and sat with her hands folded and waited. Malone looked at her, then at the letters, then at the chaotic pile of papers and ledgers behind his bar that she had already clocked in her first visual sweep of the room. He said he would think about it. She said she was staying at Mrs. Calloway's for 2 weeks and he could find her there. She was halfway to the door when he called her back and told her Monday morning. She was walking back up the main street, notebook in hand, tallying the week ahead, when she encountered Aaron Holloway coming the other direction with a bucket of feed and a look of someone who is focused entirely on where he is going and not at all on the people around him. She recognized him from the stage arrival. She had noticed him, which was easy to do, because he was a tall man with a face that looked like it had once known how to be open but had been shut for a long time, the way a window looks when someone has painted it closed. She said, "Good morning," because she was the sort of person who said good morning to people on the street. She said it to the general store owner, to Mrs. Calloway, to the stage driver who had not helped at all with her trunk, and now to this man with the bucket and the closed-off face. He looked up. The same arrested quality came over him that she had glimpsed on her arrival, that split-second freeze, as though his internal mechanisms had been built for a smaller and simpler kind of interaction, and someone had presented him with a more complex input. "Morning," he said. It was one word, and it was not particularly warm, but it was there, she thought, and she decided it counted for something. She walked on. He stood with his bucket in the middle of the street and watched her go with an expression that no one would have been able to name with certainty, but that contained, in its general vicinity, something very close to wonder. It became a pattern, which neither of them established deliberately and neither of them discussed. They were both staying at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, which meant they ate breakfast at the same long table with 4 other boarders. A traveling salesman named Gibbs who talked about his wares in intrusive detail. A retired surveyor named Hayward who was hard of hearing, but compensated by speaking loudly enough for the rest of the table. A pair of brothers named Cole and William Marsh who were in town sorting out a dispute over a water claim and ate in focused silence. And now Birdie and Aaron. Aaron had always taken his breakfast in 15 minutes flat and left without speaking, a practice so established that Mrs. Calloway no longer commented on it. The first morning Birdie joined the table, she arrived with her notebook. She brought it everywhere, which was something that would turn out to be a defining feature of her. And she said good morning to the table in general, which caused Gibbs to launch immediately into his product catalog, Hayward to mishear and respond as though she had said something about the weather, and Aaron to look at the far wall and drink his coffee. But when she had extracted herself from Gibbs's enthusiasm and Hayward's loud commentary and had settled into her eggs, she said, to nobody in particular but in a direction that happened to include Aaron, "Does anyone know if there is a hardware store in town, or would a person go to the general store for supplies like roofing nails?" Gibbs did not know. Hayward said something about the railroad. Aaron said, without looking up from his plate, "General store. Back left corner, bottom shelf." Birdie wrote it in her notebook. She said, "Thank you." He said nothing, but he didn't leave as fast as usual. The days arranged themselves around this. They would encounter each other at breakfast, or on the street, or, once she started working at Malone's, he would come in on Friday evenings, and she would be at the back table with the ledger while he sat at the bar. And occasionally she would come to ask Malone something about an entry, and she would pass near Aaron and say something brief and matter-of-fact, a question or an observation about the week, and he would answer in the smallest number of words that constituted an actual answer. And she would take what he gave and not ask for more. She understood, with the instinct that some people have for reading the spaces around what is said and unsaid, that he was a man in the business of careful minimal engagement. She did not push, but she did not stop either. She simply kept treating him like a person who was fully present, which was perhaps the most radical thing anyone had done for him in 14 months. By the third week, he said good morning first, once on a Wednesday. He said it quickly, as if testing whether the words still worked, and then looked at his breakfast as though the eggs required his complete attention. Birdie said good morning back, in the same tone she would use with anyone, not making anything of it, and went on writing in her notebook. He sat at the table 6 minutes longer than usual. On a Saturday in late April, one of her hired workers, a young man named Denny, who was supposed to be repairing the porch of her aunt's house, came to find her at Malone's with the information that the front supports were worse than they had appeared, and the whole structure needed to come down and be rebuilt, which was going to cost more than they had agreed. He said this in the apologetic way of people delivering bad news they had some role in creating, and Birdie thanked him, wrote it down, and then sat for 20 minutes after he left doing arithmetic that did not produce a satisfying answer. She was still at the table when Aaron came in for his Friday drink, except this was a Saturday, which was unusual for him. He came in because he had been to the back pasture of the livery most of the day repairing a fence the horses had broken through, and he was tired in the clean animal way, not the haunted human way, and he wanted whiskey. He saw her at the table with the notebook and he registered that something was different about how she was sitting. She was not writing. She was looking at the numbers and she had the particular stillness of someone who is thinking very hard about something that is not going well. He sat at the bar. He had his drink. He looked at the mirror behind the bar and in it, at a certain angle, he could see her table. At some point Malone came to refill his glass and said, not lowering his voice, "That Donnelly woman is going to have trouble with that property. The porch is half rotted through." Aaron did not respond. "Good bookkeeper, though," Malone added in the tone of a man giving ground reluctantly. "First time in 3 years I know what I actually have." Aaron finished his drink. He put his glass down. He said to Malone, "Do you have lumber scraps from the edition you put on last year?" Malone blinked. "Some. Why?" "I will ask her," Aaron said, and he was already standing up. He crossed the saloon to Birdie's table, and she looked up with the alert attention she always had, and he said, gracelessly, not having planned exactly how to do this, "I build things. I used to. I could look at the porch, see what it actually needs." She looked at him. He could feel the look the way you feel sun on your face when you have been cold, not dramatic, just unmistakable. She said, "You would do that," he said. "I am not doing anything else." Which was the most honest thing he had said in 14 months and also, in its backward way, the most generous. She said, "I cannot pay you much." He said, "You can pay me nothing. Consider it neighborly." The word came out and hung in the air, and he was not sure where it had come from, because he had not been neighborly in a very long time, and it sounded slightly rusty, like a door that has been closed in a damp place. But it did not sound wrong. Birdie wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, "Sunday morning. I need to go out there to direct Denny in any case." He said, "Sunday morning." He went back to the bar and sat down. Malone was looking at him with an expression he did not appreciate, which was the expression of a man who knows something is changing and finds it interesting. Aaron told him to mind his business, which was the longest sentence he had produced in a social context in well over a year, and Malone laughed and refilled his glass without being asked. He rode out to the property Sunday morning on Ghost, who was pleased to have somewhere to go with purpose. The land was 3 miles east of town on a slight rise, and the view from it was genuinely fine. The mountains to the north, the flat sage-gray valley south, and in the middle a house that had been started with ambition and finished with diminishing resources, which was an extremely common story in this part of the world. The porch Denny had been fretting about was indeed a catastrophe. Aaron walked around it twice, pressed the supports at several points, noted where the rot went and where it stopped, and decided what was salvageable. Birdie was already there in a practical work dress, her hair under a different hat, talking to Denny with her notebook open and her pencil moving. She watched Aaron examine the porch with an attention she tried to make look casual and did not quite succeed. There was something about watching a man be competent at the right thing, not performing competence, not explaining what he was doing, just doing it, that she found genuinely compelling. Aaron straightened up and said, "The east side is still sound. Everything west needs to come down. I can rebuild the west section in a day and a half with the right wood." Birdie said Malone said he had lumber scraps. "I already arranged it," Aaron said. "He is not using them." She looked at him, and again that thing happened, that not pity, more like recognition, and she said simply and warmly, "Thank you, Aaron." He stood very still for a moment. It was the first time she had used his name. He had not told it to her, which meant she had asked someone, which meant she had wanted to know. He was not sure what to do with that information either. "Right," he said. "We should start on the west support today." They worked most of the morning. Aaron worked with the focused economy of someone who had built things before, who had once built a whole ranch with his own hands and a neighbor's help, and Birdie worked beside him with the same practical steadiness, handing things without being asked, watching once to understand a task, and not needing it explained twice. Denny worked on the east side painting the boards that were sound. The three of them moved in a companionable quiet that was, for Aaron, stranger and more comfortable than anything he had experienced in 14 months. At noon Birdie produced food from a basket, bread and cold meat and 2 apples and a jar of lemonade, which she must have prepared before dawn, and they sat on the grass because the east porch boards were still drying, and ate in a sun that was warm without being cruel. Denny talked, as young men do when they are not sure of the social dynamic and fill the space by default. He asked Aaron about the livery, about Ghost, about whether Aaron had always been a horseman. Aaron answered in his usual minimal way, but he answered, and at some point Birdie put a question into the flow that was so naturally timed it felt like part of the landscape. She asked whether he had always worked with his hands or whether he had had other work, and Aaron said, with the same flatness but something else underneath, "I ranched. In Colorado." She said, "What happened to the ranch?" It was the direct question nobody had asked him because everyone in Redemption Creek had learned, collectively and individually, not to ask Aaron Holloway direct questions. But she had not been here for the 14 months of education on the subject, and she asked it the way she asked things, plainly, without malice, as though a plain question was just the most efficient way to get to the truth of something. He said, "I sold it." She waited. She was very good at waiting. It was one of the underrated skills. He said, "My wife died, and there was nothing left in Colorado to stay for." The words came out of him like something had finally decided to let them. Not all at once, not dramatically, just present in the air between them in the April sun. Birdie said, "I am sorry." Not the performative sorry that people said because they did not know what else to say. The real kind. The kind that acknowledged the actual size of the thing. She said it and let it be what it was and did not try to fix it or move past it or offer any comfort that would diminish it. Aaron looked at the mountains in the north. He said, "Clara." Her name was Clara. And it was the first time he had said her name aloud to another person in 14 months, and it felt like the kind of thing that should have been more difficult than it was, and also exactly as difficult as it was. Birdie said quietly, "Clara," not as though she was doing anything with the name, just as though she was receiving it. Acknowledging that Clara had existed and still deserved her name, said in a living person's voice. Aaron did not say anything else for a while, but he did not shut down either. He finished his apple. He thanked her for the food, and it was the most natural thank you he had produced since before Colorado. They worked the rest of the afternoon. He finished the first support and started the second. Birdie painted while Denny held boards and Aaron built, and at some point the sun got long and gold, and the light on the mountains turned the color of the inside of a peach, and Birdie stood back and looked at the half-new porch and said, with real satisfaction in her voice, "It is already better." Aaron looked at it. It was better. He had built something and it was better than it had been, and this was, he noticed distantly, a feeling he had missed, the specific satisfaction of made things. He said, "I can come back Thursday." She said, "I will make lunch again." He rode home through the evening light and Ghost moved easily under him, and Aaron Holloway noticed, because he was the kind of person who noticed things about himself even when he would rather not, that something had shifted. Something small but not nothing. He slept well for the first time in a long time. May came in with warm days and occasional cold nights, the way spring does in Nevada, unpredictable, slightly theatrical, beautiful in a way that catches you off guard. Aaron finished the porch over 2 more Sundays and 1 Thursday afternoon, and Birdie brought lunch each time, and sometimes they talked while they worked and sometimes they did not, and both were acceptable. He learned she had grown up in Ohio, had moved to St. Louis at 19 with the intention of doing something, which she had done in the form of bookkeeping and survival and saving $42. He learned her parents were both gone. He learned her aunt, the one who had left the land, had been the last of her older generation, and that Birdie had received the news of the inheritance the way a person receives unexpected rain, startled and grateful, and not entirely sure if it was going to be enough. She learned in pieces that Aaron had grown up in Missouri, that he had gone west at 21 with a man named Reed who was now in Wyoming or was possibly dead. He wasn't sure. She learned he had met Clara in Colorado, that they had been married 7 years, that they had been happy in the serious, steady way of people who build things together. She did not push for more than he offered, which was the thing he trusted about her most. By the end of May, the porch was finished and the windows were replaced, and the roof had been repaired by a man Birdie found through Perkins, and she had enough in hand from her Malone earnings to move into the house on a trial basis, which she described as a trial, because she was honest about the fact that she wasn't entirely sure the water situation was resolved. Aaron, by this time, had developed a habit he was not willing to examine too closely, which was finding reasons to be near the parts of town that Birdie was likely to be in. He told himself it was coincidence. He told Mrs. Calloway nothing because it was none of her business. He told Malone nothing because Malone would make a face. He told Ghost nothing, but Ghost seemed to know something was happening, the way horses always know, and had become brighter in the mornings. On a Friday evening in early June, Birdie came into Malone's looking different. Not dressed differently, she was always in her practical things, but she had a quality of barely contained delight that she was attempting to manage with her usual composure and not entirely succeeding. She went to Malone, said something that made him nod slowly, and then she turned and saw Aaron at the bar and came over. She said, "I have good news." He turned to face her. She was close enough that he could see the color in her cheeks, which was excitement rather than wind, and her eyes were doing the light-shifting thing they did. She said, "Malone has offered me a permanent position, not just the books. He wants me to manage the accounts going forward and take on the supply ordering, which means a regular wage instead of weekly." He said, "That is good." And then, because it was genuinely good and she deserved more than 2 words, "That is very good. You deserve it, you are clearly excellent at it." She looked at him, he looked at her. The thing that happened between them in these moments had grown steadily more complex, and neither of them had named it, because naming it felt like holding a lit match near something you were not sure was flammable. She said softly, "Thank you for saying so." He said, "It is true." There was a pause. Then she said with the careful lightness of someone testing ice, "I was thinking of celebrating. Would you, if you are not otherwise occupied, would you have dinner with me? Not here. Mrs. Calloway does a proper dinner on Friday." He was at a crossroads of the particular kind that is not about roads. He could feel it. He could feel that saying yes was going to change something, not break it, but change the shape of it, move it from the informal territory of two people who kept coincidentally being in the same places into something declared. He said, "Yes." She smiled. Not the small, polite one. The real one that went all the way up to the gray-green eyes. He was not prepared for that smile in its full version at close range, and he made a note of it in a part of himself he had thought was closed. They had dinner at Mrs. Calloway's with the other boarders, which meant Gibbs talked about his catalog and Hayward misheard things. But it also meant that at one end of the table, Aaron and Birdie had a conversation that was genuinely their own, threaded through the noise of the others. They talked about books. She had 3 in her carpet bag, which included a novel she had read 4 times and 2 practical volumes on land management. And he had not read a book in 14 months, but before that had read considerably, and they discovered a shared appreciation for a certain kind of story, the kind about people going somewhere that is difficult and arriving. They talked about the land east of town. He told her things about Nevada winters that she needed to know, practical things, survival level useful, and she wrote some of them in the notebook she had brought to dinner, and he found he did not find this strange at all. At the end of it, they walked together out to the boarding house porch. She was still here through the week, keeping the room until the house situation was fully stable, and stood in the warm June dark with the stars overhead in that particular Nevada density that makes you feel like you are inside something rather than under it. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "You can ask." She said, "Do you think you will stay in Redemption Creek? Or is this still temporary for you?" He thought about it. He was the kind of man who, when asked a real question, answered a real question rather than a convenient version of it. He said, "I came here with no intention of staying or going. I just stopped." A pause. "But recently I have been thinking about what it would mean to stay." She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, and his voice was quieter, "What about you?" She said, "I came here with land and nothing else, which most people would call a thin reason. But a thin reason is still a reason." She looked at the stars. "I think a person can build something from a thin reason if they have the right materials." He was quiet. Then he said slowly, feeling his way towards something he had not tried to articulate in a very long time, "Birdie." She said, "Yes," he said. "I have not. I should tell you that I have been a very poor excuse for a sociable person for a considerable amount of time, and I cannot promise that is entirely resolved." She said in the direct way she had, "I know." He said, "I am not sure what I am able to offer." She said, "Aaron, you rebuilt my porch. You told me your wife's name. You said thank you when the food was good. These are not nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "No, they are not nothing." She said, "I am not asking you for more than you have. I would like to keep having dinner if you are agreeable," he said. "I am agreeable." She said good night and went inside, and Aaron stood on the porch for a while in the June dark, listening to the particular silence of a western night, which is never fully silent but sounds like it could be, and thought about what it felt like to want something again. He had not wanted anything for 14 months in the specific way he had wanted something before that, in the daily, present tense, anticipatory way. And here it was, small and undeniable, the wanting of more dinners, more conversations, more of that gray-green shifting gaze. He thought about Clara. He let himself think about her the way he sometimes allowed himself when he was alone, fully, without the tight control he kept on it during the days. He thought about whether she would be angry with him for this, and he knew, with the certainty that he had always known things about her even when they were difficult, that she would not be. She had been the kind of woman who believed in people going on. She had said so, once, in a moment of terrible clarity near the end, when they had both known what was coming. She had held his face in her hands and said, with all the effort it cost her, "Go on, Aaron. When I am gone, you go on." He had not been able to imagine it then. He was just beginning to imagine it now. July came to Redemption Creek like it always did, with the particular ambition of Nevada summer relentless sun, nights that cooled enough to sleep, thunderstorms in the afternoons that rolled in from the mountains and departed just as dramatically, leaving the sage smelling like rain and the air briefly, gloriously clean. Birdie had fully moved into the house by then. She had planted a kitchen garden late in the season but manageable. She had consulted the practical book, and had acquired a cat of obscure origin who had appeared on the porch one morning and declined to leave, which she had accepted as a given and named Perimeter, because he patrolled the edges of the property with suspicious diligence. Aaron came out to the property twice a week now, sometimes to fix something. There was always something on a place this size, and sometimes simply because he had started coming twice a week, and it had become the rhythm of things. He brought supplies when he came from town. She always had something ready for lunch. They talked while they worked, and in the evening sometimes he would stay long enough to sit on the repaired porch with a cup of coffee while the light changed on the mountains, and the talking would slow and become something else. The comfortable silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill the space between them. Perimeter, the cat took to sitting between them on the porch, which Birdie found meaningful and Aaron found tolerable, which was more or less his position on most things he was coming to accept. On a Saturday in late July, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. There was a man in Redemption Creek named Wick Jarrell, who was the kind of man that towns like this produced with dispiriting regularity. 1 part genuine grievance, 2 parts bad temper, with a drinking problem that amplified both. He had a claim to a piece of land adjacent to Birdie's aunt's old property that had apparently been in dispute for some time, and that the aunt had won legally, but that Wick had never accepted with any grace. He showed up at Birdie's property on the Saturday morning when Aaron was there mending the fence on the north line, and he made his position clear loudly and with language that Birdie, standing at the front of her house, absorbed without flinching, which was its own form of courage. She said, clearly and without raising her voice, that the deed was in her name and had been filed with the county, and that if he had a legal dispute he was welcome to take it to Perkins, and then to whatever court Perkins directed him to, but that she was not going to discuss the matter further. Wick said some additional things that were worse than the initial things, and Aaron crossed the property in the time it took Birdie to draw a breath, and he placed himself in the conversation with the quiet immovability of a man who has decided something. He said, to Wick Jarrell, "The lady told you she is not discussing it further." Wick looked at Aaron the way men of his type look at other men, measuring, calculating. Aaron looked back the way a man looks when he has already done the calculation and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Wick left, loudly, on horseback, in a way designed to communicate that this was his choice and not a retreat. They both knew what it was. Birdie watched him go. Then she looked at Aaron, and her expression was composed, but he was close enough now to see what lived underneath her composure, and it was a faint tremor of something that she was not going to name. He said, "He will take it to Perkins or he will not. Either way, the deed is clear." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you all right?" She said yes, and then she said, "Actually, not entirely." Which was the most vulnerable she had been with him, and she said it straightforwardly, without apparent embarrassment, because she was that kind of person. He said, "That is a fair answer." She laughed, which was a slightly fragile sound, and he felt something rearrange itself in him completely and permanently, something he had not been conscious of, still having the specific instinct to protect a person, to put yourself between them and the thing that frightened them. Not because she couldn't manage it. She clearly could. But because he wanted to. He said, "Come sit down." They sat on the porch in the July heat, and she told him the story of her aunt's dispute with Wick Jarrell, which Perkins had briefed her on, and which was a story of boundary lines and water rights, and a man who believed his own version of events so thoroughly that the facts had no purchase on him. Aaron listened fully, which was something he was better at than talking. He asked the right questions. He said when she was done that they should go to Perkins on Monday and have the deed review documented so there was a full paper record. She said, "You will come with me?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. Then she said, with the same directness she applied to everything, "Aaron, I need you to know that I am grateful for you. I do not say that to create a debt or an obligation. I say it because it is true, and because I think you are the kind of person who is told true things and values them." He was not prepared for that either, and it sat in him warm and complicated because it was exactly right. She had understood that about him with the accuracy of someone who had been paying very careful attention, and because it was the kind of true thing that a person says when they are telling you they see you, really see you, and not just the surface you've been presenting to the world. He said, "I am grateful for you too." It was a simple sentence. It was also the truest thing he had said in 14 months, and he could feel the truth of it all the way through. They went to Perkins on Monday. The deed was reviewed and documented. Wick Jarrell, as it turned out, did come to Perkins with his complaints, and Perkins reviewed his position and gave him the same answer the previous lawyer had given, which was that the deed was clear and the legal process had concluded in Birdie's aunt's favor, and that outcome held now for Birdie. Wick took it badly, which was expected, but he also took it away with him, which was the important thing. He did not come back to the property. The matter settled into the background, not fully gone but no longer urgent. August came, and with it, a particular kind of afternoon light that turned everything in Redemption Creek the color of old gold, and Aaron Holloway found himself in a situation he had not anticipated and could not entirely explain, which was that he was happy. Not the full, uncomplicated happiness of before, and he did not expect that or want it exactly, because that happiness had Clara's shape and was hers and always would be. But this was something else, quieter, more deliberate, a happiness built from specific things rather than from the general condition of being young and unaware that loss was coming. He was happy because Birdie Donnelly said good morning and meant it. He was happy because the porch he had built was sound and would stand through the winter. He was happy because Ghost had started whinnying when they turned toward the east road, anticipating the destination the way horses anticipate what their person wants before the person knows themselves. He was happy in a way that terrified him a small amount, because happiness is terrifying when you know firsthand that it is mortal. He was working at the house one morning, fixing a section of the garden fence that perimeter the cat had apparently convinced himself was an obstacle to be defeated, when Birdie came out with coffee and sat on the porch steps and said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about what I want." He looked up. She said, "I want to stay here. I want the house finished properly. The last bedroom still needs work, and the storage building is still just a lean-to, and I know I am going to need more substantial income in the winter. I have been thinking about expanding what I offer Malone, not just accounts, but perhaps acting as a general business manager, which would justify a higher arrangement. Perkins has also suggested that any lawyer's office near this size could use someone with accounting skill, so I may approach him. She paused. I am not telling you this because I need advice. I have thought it through. I am telling you because she stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him directly and said, because you are the person I want to tell. The August light was on the mountains and Perimeter was sitting indignantly beside the fence he had compromised. And Ghost was in the small paddock Aaron had helped build at the edge of the property. And Aaron set down his hammer and walked to the porch steps and sat down beside her. He was close enough that their shoulders almost touched, which was new, and the almost touching was as loud as anything he had ever heard. He said, I have been thinking about what I want too. She said carefully, yes, he said, looking out at the mountains. I want to build something again, not fix things. Build something from the beginning. He paused. I have some money left from the Colorado sale, not a great amount, but enough to start a small operation. This country needs ranching. The railroad north of town needs beef supply. He paused again. I have been looking at the land east of yours. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. They were very close. He said it would be convenient to be neighbors, she said, with the slight tremor in her voice that she usually had good control over. Neighbors, he said, or something more eventually, if that is agreeable. She looked at him for a moment that had a great deal in it, and then she said, Aaron, are you? He said, I am not able to be elegant about this. I should tell you that in advance. I am not a man who makes speeches. He looked at the mountains. But I have not thought about the future in 14 months, and now I am thinking about it, and you are in it. Significantly, that is what I am able to tell you. She was quiet. Then she said, soft and certain, that is plenty. He reached out and took her hand, which was a thing he had thought about and not done for the full 14 months of her acquaintance, and it fit in his the way a thing fits when it belongs there. Her hands were practical hands, with ink on the side of one finger from the ledgers, and they were warm in the August morning. She leaned her head just briefly against his shoulder. He did not move. Perimeter, the cat, walked over and sat on Aaron's boot, which was either approval or coincidence. He kissed her on a Sunday in September on the porch at dusk, when the light was the color of amber and she had said something that made him laugh, actually laugh. The full version, not the thin approximation he had been managing. And she had looked so pleased about the laugh, so genuinely delighted, that he had not thought about it. He had simply leaned in and kissed her, the way a person does when the moment is the most natural thing in the world. She kissed him back without hesitation, the way she did most things. He had forgotten what it felt like, not the mechanics of it, but the specific gravity of it, the way it rearranged your relationship with time. He stayed in it longer than he had intended. She seemed in no hurry either. When they separated, she looked at him with those gray-green eyes in the amber light, and there was no complexity in her expression at all, just the plain, uncomplicated fact of her feelings, and he thought that the plainness of her was the finest thing about her. The way fine things are fine, not because they are complicated, but because they are exactly what they are. He said, I should tell you that I intend to court you properly. She said, I know. He said, I mean it formally. She said, Aaron, you have been courting me since you built my porch. I have been aware. He felt the laugh again in his chest, like a muscle being used after long disuse, not quite painful, more like alive. He said, you could have mentioned it. She said, I was waiting for you. He said, you were very patient. She said, I am very patient. He said, I know, and he kissed her again. The courtship, being properly established, proceeded with the deliberate seriousness of two people who had both survived enough to understand what they were doing and to choose it deliberately. He came to the house every day. They had Sunday dinners that went long into the evening. She went with him twice to look at the land east of hers, because he had engaged Perkins' help in investigating its availability, and she stood in the tall grass and looked at the way the mountains caught the evening, and said it was good land, which she said with the authority of someone who had been studying the practical book on land management, and knew what she was talking about. He bought the parcel in October with the last of his Colorado money, which left him lean, and he felt the rightness of being lean for a purpose he had chosen, rather than rich from a life that no longer existed. He began to build. He started with the basics, a structure for Ghost and any future stock, a water arrangement, a small living structure that was not much to look at but was sound. Birdie came out on Saturdays to help. Denny came sometimes. Two of the men from the livery came one weekend because Aaron had helped them with a difficult horse situation, and they wanted to pay it back, which was how community worked in places like this when it worked at all. It was on one of those building Saturdays, with the structure going up and the sound of hammers in the fall air and Birdie carrying boards with the focused efficiency that made him love her. And he had named it now, privately, to himself. The word he had been walking around the edge of when Denny, trying to be useful, asked Aaron something about his time in Colorado, some innocent practical question about ranching methods, and Aaron answered it fully with specific detail, referencing things he and Clara had worked out together, and Denny said, "Your wife taught you that?" Aaron said, "She did, and it came out easy, not without weight but without the crushing weight that had made him silent for so long." He talked about Clara for a few minutes, about the ranch, about the things they had built together, about what a capable person she had been, and then the conversation moved on and he worked. And later he thought about the fact that he had spoken her name 3 times in an afternoon and none of them had broken him. Birdie had heard. She had not inserted herself into it. But when they sat on her porch that evening, she reached over and held his hand, and he held hers back, and they watched the last of the October light go out of the sky, and it was good. He asked her to marry him in November. He was not elaborate about it, because she had warned him herself that she knew who she was dealing with, and he had internalized this. He asked her on the porch in the evening with coffee going cold in their hands, and he said, looking at her, because he had learned that she deserved to be looked at when things of importance were being said, "I would like to marry you, Birdie. I would like to spend my life at it. I know I am not easy company, and I know what I am offering is not simple, and I know there are still pieces of me that are not finished being put back together. But I am building something and I want you in it, and I am asking." She said before the sentence was fully over, "Yes." He said, "That was quick." She said, "I decided in July. I was waiting for you to ask." He said, "You are going to keep telling me you waited for me." She said, "It will be a theme." He laughed again. It was getting easier, the laughing. Not replaced, nothing was replaced, but alongside, room made. She had taught him that over the months just by being the kind of person who made room. They were married in December in the unfinished church, which was still unfinished but had walls and a roof and enough pews for the people of Redemption Creek who chose to come, which was more than Aaron expected. Malone came. Perkins came. Mrs. Calloway came in a hat that was her best effort. Denny came and stood in the back looking proud of having been part of things. 2 women from the town who had befriended Birdie came and cried appropriately. The Marsh brothers, who were still in town on their water claim, which had become a longer affair than anticipated, came because they had witnessed enough of the story to feel invested. Birdie wore her best dress, which she had remade from a pale blue fabric she had found in the general store, altered herself by lamplight over 2 weeks, and the result was simple and exactly right. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers because there were no fresh ones in December, and the dried ones were prairie wildflowers she had collected and dried herself over the fall, which Aaron thought was the most Birdie Donnelly solution possible and also beautiful. He wore his good coat, which he had not worn in 16 months, and he had let Prout the barber cut his hair and trim his beard, and he stood at the front of the unfinished church with the minister, a traveling man named Aldridge who came through on a regular circuit. And when Birdie walked in on her own, no father, no brother, self-accompanied, because that was who she was and came to stand beside him, he looked at her and felt the full, clean weight of being present in a moment, of choosing this, of being, against considerable odds, alive enough to choose. He said the words the minister gave him to say, and he said them clearly. And when it was done and Aldridge pronounced them married, he kissed her in the unfinished church, while Malone made a sound of approbation, and Mrs. Calloway applied a handkerchief to her face, and Denny started clapping at the wrong moment, and then everyone else clapped anyway. They had a small celebration at Malone's. Malone had provided it himself, gratis, on the grounds that Birdie's management of his books had saved him enough money to be generous about it, which was the most romantic thing he had ever been party to in his own telling. There was music from a fiddle player named Tom who was one of the regular customers, and there was food, and there was dancing on the saloon floor that Aaron participated in with the careful determination of a man who has agreed to do a thing and will do it thoroughly. He was not a graceful dancer. Birdie was not either, it turned out. They were both thoroughly determined and not particularly skilled, and this made them very happy. That night in the house on her land, which was now their land, the east property his and the original parcel hers, and both of them together a respectable size, they sat by the stove in the December cold, newly married and quiet, and it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that needed no filling. He said, "Are you content?" She said, "I am very content." He said, "I want you to know, I want to say it plainly. I love you." She looked at him. Then she said simply, "I know, I have known for a while." She took his hand. "I love you too, Aaron, I have known that for a while as well." He said, "I am going to work on saying it more." She said, "I know that too." He laughed and she laughed, and Perimeter the cat, who had been sitting on the chair by the stove with the proprietary confidence of someone who had lived here first and granted them occupancy, yawned enormously and went back to sleep. Winter in Redemption Creek was its own thing, harder than the fall, quieter than the summer, with a beauty that required willingness to see it. The snow came in January, not the storms of the higher elevations, but enough to coat everything, and the sage turned silver-white and the mountains went from their usual blue-gray to something luminous. And Aaron, riding Ghost out to see to the small herd he had acquired in October 4 cattle, a beginning, saw the light on the range and thought, "This is mine to see. This morning is mine." He had been thinking that more. It was the particular gift of having come back from a long absence inside yourself, the return of the present tense, the specific sensory reality of a morning, the way it lands on you with its own weight instead of passing through you like wind through an empty house. He fixed things in the winter months. He also built the storage building proper now, not the lean-to. He extended the stable. He laid plans for a second room added to the house which would be needed, he had already decided, and which he told Birdie about one evening with a directness that matched her own. She had looked up from her notebook and said, "A second room," he said, "for when we need it." She said carefully, "Aaron, are you," he said, "I would like to have children." "If that is something you want, I am asking what you want before I assume." She was quiet. Then she said with a smile that was private and warm, "It is something I want." He said, "Good." She said, "For the record, you could have just said you wanted children without framing it as a construction project." He said, "I find it useful to have a practical attachment to the conversation." She laughed, and he took the laugh as the agreement that it was, and felt the future settle in him more fully, something alive and expected, the way spring settles in you even in the middle of winter if you know the country well enough. Birdie continued her work with Malone through the winter, and added an arrangement with Perkins as well, keeping the law office's accounts on a monthly basis, which brought in enough for them to manage the two properties with room to build savings again. She was methodical about the money in the way she was methodical about everything, the notebook, the clear columns, the weekly accounting that she would review at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings while Aaron read, because she had been right that he was a reader when given the chance, and he had begun to acquire books again. It felt domestic in the best sense, in the sense of something made by two people together. Clara had made a home with him in Colorado and he had loved it fully, and now he was making one again, different in every particular but built with the same materials, care, intention, the daily choosing of another person. Spring came. The April of their first spring together, 1 year after Birdie had arrived on the afternoon stage and hit him with a carpet bag and said, "Are you all right?" was louder and more full of growth than any April Aaron had experienced since Colorado. He planted his first proper field, not a large one, but real, with the intent of having fodder for the herd when winter came again. Birdie's kitchen garden came back from its winter dormancy with an ambition that surprised even her. The apple tree at the edge of her original property, which had been dormant and which neither of them had been sure was alive, produced buds in April and by May had small, hard apples forming. 1 year after she had arrived, Birdie told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with coffee, which was where they had most of their important conversations. She said it directly because she did everything directly, and she watched his face for the response. He was still. Then his face did something complicated and full, and he got up from his chair and he came around the table and he held her, not dramatically, but completely, the way he did the few things he did with his whole self, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said into her hair, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" She said, "I am well. I am a little tired in the mornings, but otherwise well." He pulled back enough to look at her face. He said, "Good, tell me what you need." She said, "I need you to finish the second room before November." He said, "It will be done in July." She said, "I know, you always do it faster than you say." He said, "I love you." She said, "I know that too." He kissed her forehead and sat back down and picked up his coffee, and they both looked at each other across the table in the May morning, and the look had everything in it. The full weight of what they had built together, what they were about to build, the long road from a carpet bag collision in the main street of a town that had named itself after something it could not quite achieve, and this kitchen, and this morning, and this. The second room was, in fact, finished by the end of July. Aaron did not just finish it, he finished it properly, with plastered walls and a proper window and a floor that was level, which the rest of the house was not quite. He made a small rocking chair, his first piece of furniture, which came out with the slight imperfections of a first attempt, and was therefore the most genuine thing he had ever built. He set it in the corner of the second room and stood back and looked at it and thought about Clara, who had wanted children and who was gone, and he let himself think about her clearly and fully and with love, and then he turned and went to find his wife. He found Birdie in the kitchen garden in the August heat, in a wide hat, moving with the particular careful deliberateness of late pregnancy, her notebook on the porch rail because she had been recording something and had set it down to tend the tomatoes, which apparently could not wait. He stood at the garden fence and watched her for a minute. This woman who had arrived with $42 and 2 carpet bags, and the habit of saying kind words to people who had forgotten what to do with them, and who had made herself a life, and made herself a place in his life, by the simple, extraordinary method of being exactly who she was. She saw him watching and said, "The tomatoes are going to be tremendous this year." He said, "I can see that." She said, "You should look pleased. You will be eating tremendous tomatoes all winter." He said, "I am very pleased about the tomatoes." She laughed at his expression, and he crossed the garden and kissed her, carefully and thoroughly, right there between the tomatoes and the bean runners, and she laughed again against his mouth. Their son was born in October, which Aaron said later was a fine month to arrive the world at its best color, the heat gone and the worst cold not yet come. The birth was managed by the town's new doctor, a young woman named Evelyn Drake, who had come to Redemption Creek the previous spring, and whose presence had been greeted with considerable skepticism by the town and absolute relief by Birdie, who had said upon meeting her that she was exactly what was needed. Dr. Drake was efficient and calm and excellent, and Aaron, who had been sent to the porch by her with some firmness, sat in the October morning with his hands on his knees and listened to the sounds of the house and waited. And when it was done, and the cry of his son came through the wall, he sat very still for a moment and felt everything, all of it at once. The grief and the joy and the distance from Colorado, and the length of the silence he had kept, and the particular morning in April when a carpet bag had caught him in the shoulder and changed his direction, and he was not ashamed of any of it. Birdie was tired and luminous and satisfied in the particular way of someone who has done a very large thing very well. She held the baby with the matter-of-fact competence she applied to everything, and she looked up at Aaron when he came in and said, "He is all yours for a moment. I need to sleep." Aaron took his son, who was small and red-faced and deeply serious-looking, and sat in the rocker in the second room, and the chair that had the slight imperfection of a first attempt held both of them with no trouble at all. They named him James, not after anyone, simply because when they had discussed it, both had arrived at the name separately, and when she had said it and he had said he had been thinking the same, they had agreed it was a sign of something, though neither of them was very mystical about signs. James Holloway was a compact, observant baby who slept in serious blocks and woke with the expression of a man who has a number of concerns to work through. He looked at Aaron with the thorough evaluating gaze of someone taking an inventory, which Aaron found entirely relatable, and he looked at Birdie with an uncomplicated adoration that Aaron also found entirely relatable. The months that followed were full in a way that surprised Aaron. He had known in the abstract that a child changes the nature of time, makes it slower and faster simultaneously, compresses some things and expands others. What he had not anticipated was how much of himself he would find in it, the specific pleasure of small tasks done for the purpose of someone who does not yet know you are doing them. He built a crib. He learned to hold James in the particular way that kept him settled. He talked to him in the mornings while Birdie slept the extra hour she needed, not stories exactly, more like a running account of the world, what the light was doing, what the mountains looked like, what he planned to do with the herd that day. James listened with great attention and then usually went back to sleep, which Aaron found perfectly reasonable. Summer came again, their second summer. James was 8 months old and attempting to crawl with immense concentration. Birdie had renegotiated her arrangement with Malone and was now effectively his business manager, with the supply ordering and the accounts and the scheduling of staff, which she managed from home 3 days a week and from the saloon too, bringing James along in the first months and then, as he grew more mobile and curious, leaving him in Aaron's care when the situation permitted. The ranch, small as it was producing. Aaron had grown the herd to 12 cattle by the spring, had established the fodder field properly, and had begun to understand the particular rhythms of this land, where the water ran reliable, where the ground softened in the wet months, where the fence needed checking after a hard wind. He was good at it, the way he had been good at the Colorado ranch, and it was the same feeling, not nostalgia, not imitation, but the genuine satisfaction of competence applied to something real. Redemption Creek had, over these 2 years, changed in small ways that mattered. The church got its steeple, a civic project that had finally been completed by a combination of community labor and a donation from a man passing through who felt guilty about something and did not explain what. Dr. Drake had established a proper practice. A new family named Osterhaus had taken up a claim north of town and were becoming the kind of neighbors who were useful in the way all the best neighbors are reliable in a crisis, present without intrusion. The railroad had been rumored again for the north route, and this time it seemed more certain, which was changing the character of the town in the way that certainty about futures always does. People started planting more permanent things. Birdie heard the railroad rumor from Malone and wrote it in her notebook, and when she brought it home, Aaron listened and then said what he thought, which was that if the railroad came north, the demand for beef supply would increase significantly, and that they should plan to expand the herd, which would require hiring a hand, which would require building accommodation. She said, "I will work out the numbers." He said, "I know you will." she said, looking at him from across the kitchen table where James was sitting in his high chair pressing porridge into interesting shapes. "Are you happy, Aaron?" He looked at her. He looked at his son. He looked around the kitchen that they had made together, with the practical curtains she had made from fabric bought at the general store, and the shelves he had built, and the notebook on the counter, and the cat asleep on the chair. He said, "Yes." A pause. "More than I thought I was going to be. More than seemed likely." She said Clara would be glad. He did not flinch. He said, "I know. She told me to go on." He looked at Birdie steadily. "I did not know what that looked like until I found it." Birdie reached across the table and put her hand over his, and James, sensing the moment, slapped both hands into his porridge and looked enormously pleased with the result. The years settled in around them the way good years do, present in the specifics, full without being frantic, marked by the landmarks of a life built deliberately. The ranch grew. Aaron hired a hand the following spring, a quiet man named Cal who was good with horses and who took his meals with them and became, in the way of these things, part of the household's ecosystem. Birdie's position with Malone grew to the point where she was, in practical terms, the one running the business operations, which suited Malone, who was better at the human side of the saloon than the logistical side. Perkins added 2 more days a month to her arrangement. Their second child was a girl, born 3 years after James, whom they named Ruth, after no one in particular and after something in the sound of it, which they both liked. Ruth arrived with considerably more ease than James had, and with considerably more volume, which she maintained as a characteristic. She was a child of constant motion and loud opinion, the counterpart to her brother's serious evaluation of everything, and the house with both of them in it had a quality of whether changeable, vital, occasionally overwhelming, always alive. Aaron, watching them in the yard one afternoon, James explaining something to Ruth with great seriousness, and Ruth listening approximately 1/3 of the time before running off to investigate something else, thought about the version of himself that had come into Redemption Creek on a gray horse with grief taking up all the available space. He thought about 14 months of silence, of flat transactional words, of the boarding house ceiling that had no answers. He thought about a carpet bag and a genuine question and 3 sentences that he had not known how to answer. He had tried anyway. That was the thing. He had tried anyway, with yes and fine and yes, and I am fine, the most inadequate response in the history of spoken language. And she had taken what he gave and said good, and had kept saying good morning, and had not asked for more than he had, and had waited for him to find his way back to the person who could give more. He went inside and found her at the kitchen table with the notebook. She always had the notebook, working through something that had the look of a quarterly account, and he put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned her head back against him, and they stayed like that for a moment in the kitchen of the house they had built together, while the children made noise in the yard, and the Nevada afternoon light came through the window they had put in themselves, the one that looked out toward the mountains. She said without looking up, "Everything all right?" He said, "Everything is very good." She said, "James is explaining the water cycle to the chickens again." He said, "Is it taking?" She said, "The chickens seem receptive." He laughed, and it was easy, the laugh as easy as breathing, as natural as the morning. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, and she nudged her notebook toward him so he could see what she was working on, because that was what they did, the sharing of the daily arithmetic of their life. And he looked at the neat columns and said something useful about the supply projection for winter, and she wrote it down with the same pencil she had been writing with since before he knew her. And outside the window the mountains were the color of late afternoon, and James was still explaining things to the chickens, and Ruth was laughing at something only she knew. And this was the life, not the grand version, not the romance story version, but the real one, made of accumulated mornings and honest conversations, and the particular kind of love that is not about the feeling alone, but about the daily, deliberate, fully committed choosing of another person, and all of it was good. Aaron Holloway, who had not said a kind word to a living soul in 14 months, had found his way back through a carpet bag and a genuine question, and the steady, patient, entirely real love of Birdie Donnelly, who was now Birdie Holloway, who sat beside him at the kitchen table with ink on her fingers and the notebook open between them, and who he planned to spend every remaining morning choosing, for as long as the mornings kept coming. Outside, the Ruby Mountains caught the last of the day's light and held it a little longer than the valley did, the way good things hold the light, making it last just past when you expected it to go, giving you a little more than you thought you had. Ruth came running in from the yard, straight to Aaron, which she always did, announcing something about a frog she had found in the kitchen garden that required immediate adult assessment. He picked her up and she grabbed his face in both hands and said, with the absolute authority of a 3-year-old who has identified a priority, "Papa, frog." He said, looking at Birdie over their daughter's head, "We should go see about a frog." Birdie looked at him with the gray-green eyes that still shifted with the light, the eyes of a woman who paid attention to things, who noticed what other people missed, who had noticed him on a Thursday in April when he had been trying his best to be unnoticeable, and who had offered him the first of many kind words, and who had waited, patient and steady, for him to find out that he had one left in him too. She closed the notebook. She said, "We should absolutely go see about a frog." And they went together out into the Nevada evening, into the light that was lasting just a little longer than expected, and the mountains were still there, solid and certain and unchanged, and the life they had made around each other spread out in every direction, solid and certain and entirely their own.